In early 2026, the United States government began acting like a panic buyer facing an impending hurricane. The target wasn't fuel or munitions, it was dirt. Washington quietly authorized a $12 billion emergency procurement initiative, classified under the moniker Project Vault. The objective was immediate baseline acquisition of critical rare earth elements. This wasn't a standard logistical stockpile expansion. It was a desperate maneuver to plug a catastrophic vulnerability in the American defense industrial base before the supply chain snapped. The paradox is staggering. The Pentagon operates the most advanced aerospace platforms on Earth, like the F-35 Lightning. Yet, the supremacy rests on a fragile, outsourced foundation. Without highly specialized permanent magnets, gallium radar arrays, and germanium optics, a $100 million fifth-generation fighter is effectively an inert titanium paperweight on the tarmac. We assumed total technological dominance. But Beijing recognized a fundamental truth. You do not need to shoot down an American fighter jet if you can legally withhold its components. The nature of global conflict has fundamentally mutated. World War I-II isn't being fought with hypersonic glide vehicles or carrier strike groups. It is being fought with export licenses. To understand this geopolitical chokehold, you must confront a singular, terrifying metric. The People's Republic of China currently controls 91% of global critical mineral refining capacity. We are talking about antimony, gallium, and germanium, the absolute bedrock of modern semiconductor architecture, artificial intelligence infrastructure, and advanced kinetic interceptors. The West is entirely dependent. This brings us to the core misconception of the resource war. The vulnerability is not a lack of raw materials. It is the refining illusion. Politicians consistently boast about domestic mining initiatives, pointing to vast untapped deposits in Nevada and California. But possessing raw ore is strategically meaningless without processing infrastructure. Extracting raw dirt from the ground is merely step one. The true geopolitical leverage lies in the agonizingly complex, highly toxic chemical separation process required to achieve commercial purity. Transforming raw monazite sand into a functional neodymium magnet requires decades of metallurgical mastery. It is an industrial dark art that the United States effectively abandoned in the late 90s. While Washington outsourced heavy industry to optimize corporate balance sheets, Beijing aggressively subsidized state-owned refining conglomerates, operating at massive financial losses to monopolize the global market. They spent 30 years building an impenetrable fortress of intellectual property around rare earth chemistry. You cannot simply replicate this infrastructure overnight with a sudden injection of federal capital. Furthermore, rare earth refining yields thousands of tons of radioactive and highly toxic byproducts. China absorbed this devastating environmental cost to secure absolute leverage over the 21st century. Western environmental regulations make rapid domestic replication virtually impossible. A single domestic refining facility faces a labyrinth of EPA compliance mandates, dragging construction timelines into the next decade. Establishing a fully independent, closed-loop supply chain would require trillions in subsidized capital and a complete overhaul of domestic industrial policy. Time is a luxury Washington no longer possesses. This asymmetric dependency grants Beijing unprecedented diplomatic leverage. They hold the master switch to the American high-tech economy, capable of inducing a systemic paralysis at their discretion. Wall Street remains largely oblivious to the sheer fragility of the hardware supply chain. A sudden embargo on these refined elements would trigger an immediate, catastrophic market contraction. As one senior defense logistics official noted in a declassified memo, "We have built a digital empire on a foundation of imported Chinese chemistry. The implications extend far beyond the Pentagon. The entire artificial intelligence revolution, the massive data centers and neural network clusters relies exclusively on these precise, imported materials. The highly touted green energy transition is equally captive. High-capacity turbines and advanced battery matrices are physically impossible to scale without unfettered access to Beijing's refining output. With the national defense stockpile approaching historic lows, the $12 billion Project Vault initiative was a frantic attempt to buy time. But time was already running out. Because in late 2025, Beijing prepared a devastating regulatory counterstrike. They were about to weaponize the very trade mechanisms Washington had invented. The board was set for checkmate. To understand the sheer brilliance of Beijing's legal counteroffensive, we must examine the Foreign Direct Product Rule. It is a formidable weapon, historically wielded exclusively by the United States government. For decades, Washington utilized this extraterritorial mandate to crush adversaries. If a foreign entity used even a fraction of American software, they were subject to strict United States export controls. This was the exact legal architecture deployed to systematically dismantle Huawei's global supply chain and cripple Russian defense manufacturing. It was the ultimate expression of American economic hegemony. But in late 2025, the geopolitical chessboard flipped. Beijing meticulously drafted a mirrored legislative framework, weaponizing the exact same extraterritorial logic against the American defense industrial base. They declared that any advanced technology utilizing Chinese refined critical minerals, regardless of where it was manufactured, now required explicit authorization from Beijing's Ministry of Commerce. This was not a standard embargo. It was a molecular tracking mechanism. Beijing asserted jurisdiction over the chemical derivatives themselves, effectively claiming ownership over the downstream global supply chain. While Washington attempted to blockade silicon logic chips, China quietly blockaded the raw atomic elements necessary to build the machines that manufacture those very chips. The asymmetry was devastating. Tier 1 defense contractors in Virginia and Maryland were suddenly paralyzed. A sprawling network of global aerospace conglomerates found themselves legally non-compliant with a foreign adversary's trade mandate overnight. Consider the anatomy of a modern interceptor missile. It contains thousands of subcomponents sourced from allied nations. Yet, deep within its guidance system sits a microscopic gallium nitride amplifier. Because that single amplifier relied on Chinese chemical refining, the entire multi-million-dollar kinetic interceptor was now legally embargoed by Beijing. Production lines slammed to a catastrophic halt. Internal Pentagon audits revealed a staggering vulnerability. 73% of critical defense acquisition programs contained embedded Chinese refined elements, rendering them instantly vulnerable to this new legal choke point. Tracking these elements became an absolute auditing nightmare. Supply chain managers were forced to trace fractions of a gram of germanium through a labyrinth of international shell companies. Allied intermediary nations were caught directly in the crossfire. Precision manufacturing hubs in Japan, South Korea, and Germany faced devastating secondary sanctions if they supplied American defense programs. Beijing effectively weaponized geography and globalized trade networks against the Pentagon. By threatening Allied manufacturing centers, they isolated the United States without deploying a single naval asset. The financial fallout was instantaneous. Compliance overhead and supply chain insurance premiums for hardware manufacturers skyrocketed, triggering a massive wave of capital flight from the defense sector. One anonymous defense contractor bluntly summarized the existential crisis to a closed-door congressional committee. We simply cannot build an advanced radar system without asking Beijing for permission. The physical reality of this legal maneuver manifested at maritime ports worldwide. Shipping containers packed with critical aerospace components were indefinitely detained at customs, awaiting Chinese export licenses. Logistics commanders stared at a terrifying metric. Domestic inventory reserves for specialized rare earth compounds dropped to a critical 45-day supply. The strategic countdown clock had officially started. As the timeline advanced into early 2026, Beijing's Ministry of Commerce began systematically denying export licenses for high-grade antimony and gallium, tightening the geopolitical noose with surgical precision. The illusion of rapid decoupling shattered. Politicians demanded immediate independence, but the physical reality of chemical engineering meant alternative supply chains were a decade away from commercial viability. Commercial technology giants quickly realized they were collateral damage in this sovereign conflict. Silicon Valley hardware developers watched their hardware production schedules disintegrate under the new regulatory regime. Vast assembly floors across Allied territories went completely dark. The intricate ballet of just-in-time global manufacturing was brought to its knees by a deliberate chemical supply starvation. The Pentagon's elite logistics directorate recognized the grim truth. Project Vault's emergency stockpiles were merely a temporary bandage on a fatal arterial wound. It would not sustain a war. Frantic, classified briefings flooded Capitol Hill. The intelligence community confirmed that Beijing was not bluffing. They had successfully engineered a kill switch for the American defense industrial base. This unprecedented vulnerability forced Washington into a desperate legislative corner. The resulting political panic would trigger the most aggressive economic statecraft maneuver in modern American history. Behind closed doors, the realization of total supply chain capture sparked absolute pandemonium. The Pentagon's most classified logistics directors were summoned to Capitol Hill for emergency congressional briefings. Defense aerospace executives sat in darkened committee rooms, delivering a grim ultimatum. Without immediate legislative intervention, the American military-industrial complex would face systemic, irreversible paralysis within months. One defense contractor's testimony leaked to the press, stating simply, "We have the blueprints, we have the capital, but we do not have the chemistry to build the machines." This absolute terror birthed a monstrous piece of legislation, dubbed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act by political insiders. It was an unprecedented, frantic attempt at industrial resurrection. The legislation authorized a staggering $500 billion in direct federal subsidies, tax immunities, and executive bypasses. The goal was to instantaneously manifest a domestic critical mineral refining sector. Washington effectively offered a blank check to any corporate conglomerate willing to build heavy chemical separation facilities on American soil. It was the ultimate desperate capitalist mobilization, but this legislation exposed a fatal flaw in American strategic thinking. Washington assumed capital could instantly bend the laws of physics and chemical engineering. They were dead wrong. You cannot simply print time. Even with unlimited federal funding and zero regulatory oversight, constructing a commercial-scale rare earth separation facility requires a minimum of 5 to 7 years. The metallurgical dark arts require bespoke industrial machinery, highly toxic waste containment protocols, and specialized chemical engineers, a workforce the United States had systematically dismantled decades ago. When Wall Street algorithms processed the physical reality of this 7-year timeline gap, market panic accelerated. Throwing billions at the problem did not resolve the immediate geopolitical chokehold. Desperate, the State Department pivoted to allied nations, frantically attempting to secure raw and refined material from Australia and Canada to bridge the terrifying multi-year production gap. But Beijing had already anticipated this maneuver. Using their newly weaponized foreign direct product rule, they threatened devastating secondary sanctions against any allied mining conglomerate cooperating with Washington. The diplomatic cables were ruthless. Beijing's message to Canberra and Ottawa was clear: supply the American defense base, and you will be permanently locked out of the Chinese market. Allied treaties began to fracture under the immense economic pressure. Decades of mutual defense agreements were suddenly paralyzed by the sheer gravity of China's absolute monopoly over critical chemistry. The United States found itself in an impossible standoff. The world's preeminent superpower possessed unmatched kinetic military force, yet was entirely neutralized by a foreign regulatory bureaucracy. As 2026 progressed, the Project Vault stockpiles continued to plummet. The 45-day supply window shrank to 30, then 20. The strategic countdown was accelerating toward absolute zero. Deep within the Pentagon, logistics commanders began drafting contingency protocols for a scenario they never believed possible: the total rationing of advanced weaponry production due to material starvation. It meant halting the assembly of fifth-generation fighters, pausing the deployment of advanced radar arrays, and delaying the modernization of the Pacific Naval Fleet. A strategic nightmare realized. The paralysis quickly spread from the defense sector into commercial tech. Silicon Valley giants faced severe component shortages, forcing massive delays in the rollout of next-generation artificial intelligence infrastructure. The Nasdaq plummeted as investors realized the hardware foundation of the digital economy was fundamentally compromised. The legal chokehold was systematically suffocating American technological supremacy from the inside out. The geopolitical clock was ticking. Beijing watched as Washington scrambled, knowing perfectly well that the American legislative machine could not outpace the physical reality of supply chain exhaustion. State-level maneuvers escalated. The White House began classifying critical mineral supply chains under national security emergency protocols, attempting to forcefully commandeer any remaining domestic inventory for military use. But commandeering inventory doesn't create new supply. The map of global trade routes was now firmly controlled by a single centralized authority in Beijing, dictating the flow of modern power. The ultimate checkmate was approaching. As one intelligence director warned, "We are standing on the edge of an industrial cliff, and they are holding the only rope." The boardroom panic had failed to produce a viable escape velocity. The stage was now set for the most devastating economic and military climax of the 21st century. By late 2026, the hypothetical scenarios modeled in Pentagon war rooms became physical reality. Project Vault's emergency reserves finally evaporated. The strategic countdown clock hit absolute zero. The 45-day stockpile was completely exhausted. For the first time since the Second World War, the United States military was operating without a secure domestic supply of critical manufacturing materials. Beijing executed the final phase of the foreign direct product rule. A total, uncompromising embargo on refined gallium, germanium, and high-grade antimony was officially initiated across all global shipping lanes. The immediate physical impact was staggering. Massive container ships carrying essential precursor chemicals were halted in the Pacific, ordered by Beijing to return to port or face catastrophic secondary sanctions. The asymmetry of this warfare was terrifying. The United States possessed the most lethal blue water navy in human history, completely paralyzed by administrative paperwork and chemical export licenses. Classified readiness reports leaked to the press, revealing a devastating collapse in maintenance schedules. Without replacement components, active-duty fighter squadrons were quietly grounded to cannibalize parts for operational aircraft. Deep inside classified hangars, $100 million stealth platforms were methodically stripped of their advanced radar arrays. The military was literally eating itself to maintain a facade of global operational readiness. Defense logistics directors tracked the contagion as it paralyzed the Pacific Fleet. Critical upgrades to Aegis combat systems were indefinitely suspended, leaving carrier strike groups vulnerable to next-generation hypersonic threats. A senior naval commander delivered a chilling assessment to the Armed Services Committee. "We are deploying multi-billion-dollar warships with blind spots, simply because we cannot source the necessary optics." The economic devastation mirrored the military collapse. Trillions in market capitalization evaporated as tech giants realized their next-generation artificial intelligence server farms could not be physically constructed without these elements. Silicon Valley's most elite hardware developers were utterly neutralized. The entire supply chain for advanced neural network processors slammed into a brick wall, triggering a massive wave of corporate insolvencies. The timeline for the American green energy transition was violently pushed back by a decade. High-capacity battery production lines went dark, unable to source the purified graphite, refined lithium. Vast fields of partially constructed wind turbines stood frozen across the American Midwest. They became towering, rusted monuments to a nation that had entirely outsourced its industrial sovereignty to a rival. Desperation in Washington reached a boiling point. The National Security Council drafted extreme contingency plans, including the potential deployment of naval escorts to forcefully extract raw materials from Allied mines. But tactical extraction was a delusion. You can escort raw dirt across the ocean with a destroyer, but you cannot force a non-existent domestic chemical plant to refine it. The mathematics of the crisis were unforgiving. Even with emergency wartime mobilization, the United States was facing a minimum shortfall of 3,000 metric tons of refined tactical materials annually. The intelligence community mapped Beijing's ultimate objective. This was never just about crippling a few aerospace programs. It was a calculated maneuver to permanently dethrone the American unipolar global order. The doctrine of asymmetric denial had reached its absolute zenith. As one geopolitical analyst noted, they built a fortress out of chemistry and locked the United States on the outside. Emergency diplomatic channels were opened, but Beijing refused to negotiate. They demanded sweeping geopolitical concessions in the South China Sea in exchange for a temporary lifting of the chemical blockade. The president was presented with an impossible dilemma: surrender strategic territorial influence in the Pacific, or watch the American defense industrial base slowly suffocate under an unbreakable regulatory stranglehold. Every day, the blockade continued. The technological gap widened. While American factories sat paralyzed in darkness, Chinese state-owned enterprises accelerated their production of next-generation autonomous weapons and advanced sensor grids. A terrifying new global architecture began to crystallize. Emerging economies watched the United States fail to break the chokehold, and quietly began aligning their supply chains with Beijing's centralized ecosystem. The dollar's hegemony shuddered as nations realized fiat currency was useless if it could not purchase the physical building blocks of modern technology. A new era of resource-backed power emerged. The United States was effectively under siege, trapped in a blockade without a single hostile vessel off its coast. The illusion of absolute American sovereignty had been surgically, flawlessly shattered. The climax of the resource war forced a brutal reckoning. The superpower had been outmaneuvered not by kinetic force, but by a masterful, multi-decade mastery of the global periodic table. The dust of the 2026 embargo is still settling, but the strategic landscape is permanently altered. Washington has awakened to a terrifying new epoch of geopolitical reality. The era of unfettered, globalized, just-in-time manufacturing is officially dead. In its place, a fractured, hyper-regionalized world order has emerged, divided by impenetrable regulatory iron curtains. The Pentagon now operates under a brutal dual reality. They possess the most advanced kinetic strike capabilities ever conceived, yet remain entirely tethered to a hostile supply chain. For a century, global conflicts were dictated by the flow of crude oil and the control of maritime straits. Today, the new battlefields are microscopic and molecular. Power is no longer measured strictly by aircraft carrier strike groups or nuclear silos. True 21st century hegemony is defined by absolute sovereignty over complex chemical refining infrastructure. Looking forward to the 2032s, the multi-trillion-dollar artificial intelligence revolution faces a sobering bottleneck. The physical hardware required to run advanced neural networks cannot magically materialize. Analysts project that domestic American refining capacity will not reach commercial viability until at least 2032. That leaves a massive 6-year vulnerability window where Beijing dictates technological progress. In response, a shadow industry of urban mining is rapidly expanding. Defense contractors are quietly ripping apart obsolete electronics to harvest trace amounts of critical rare earth elements. Classified DARPA initiatives have pivoted aggressively toward material substitution. Billions are being poured into experimental physics, desperately searching for synthetic alternatives to gallium and germanium. Simultaneously, a new type of international alliance is forming. We are witnessing the birth of sovereign resource blocks coalitions built entirely around the mutual defense of critical metallurgy. As the Secretary of Defense recently warned, the next NATO won't be a treaty of armies. It will be a cartel of chemical engineers and heavy industry. This desperation is pushing extraction into extreme frontiers. Allied nations are fast-tracking controversial deep-sea mining operations, carving up the Pacific floor to bypass Chinese terrestrial monopolies. Autonomous submersibles now comb the abyssal plains for polymetallic nodules. It is a high-stakes, multi-billion-dollar gamble to secure the raw atomic ingredients of future global supremacy. But the economic friction is inescapable. The cost of manufacturing advanced defense platforms has permanently skyrocketed, fundamentally breaking the Pentagon's long-term budgetary forecasts and forcing massive programmatic cuts. A single F-35 fighter is now projected to cost 30% more to produce, strictly due to the extreme premiums placed on non-Chinese, allied refined critical minerals. Washington fell into a classic geopolitical trap. They mistook software dominance for absolute power, entirely forgetting that the cloud is ultimately built on very specific, heavy dirt. Beijing did not invent a new weapon. They simply read the American playbook, mastered the unglamorous mechanics of heavy industry, and waited patiently for the trap to spring. Moving forward, the weaponization of the foreign direct product rule will not remain an isolated incident. It is the new baseline for all future great power competition. Any nation that cannot secure its base molecular supply chain will be reduced to a vassal state, entirely dependent on the bureaucratic mercy of a foreign adversary. Declassified postmortems of the Project Vault crisis reveal a chilling consensus. The United States military-industrial complex was defeated without a single shot being fired in anger. It was a silent administrative victory achieved exclusively through export licenses, customs declarations, and an impenetrable, multi-decade monopoly over the dark arts of rare earth chemical separation. The map of the world has been redrawn. The borders that matter are no longer defined by rivers or mountains, but by the location of operational chemical refineries. The future belongs to those who build. Financial engineering and software algorithms are useless if you cannot physically forge the hardware required to project that digital power. The 2026 critical mineral chokehold is a permanent scar on American strategic dominance. It is a stark reminder that true geopolitical leverage is dug from the earth. The era of the kinetic superpower has ended. The age of the supply chain hegemon has officially begun. The board is set. The next move is ours.